Hello and welcome to Craftwork, a podcast by writers for writers.
Craftwork is recorded in Fredericton, New Brunswick, on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqiyik, the people of the Wolastoq River. I'm Miriam Riche.
And I'm Mike Thorne, will be your co-hosts. The music for this podcast is composed and recorded by Randy Nichols-Schroeder.
Meghan Kemp-Gee is the author of The Animal in the Room, available through Coach House Books that came out in 2023, as well as 3 poetry chapbooks, What I Meant to Ask, Things to Buy in New Brunswick, and more. She also co-created the webcomic Contested Strip, recently adapted as a graphic novel, One More Year, and she is a PhD candidate at UNB and currently lives in North Vancouver, BC. Welcome, Meghan. So good to see you.
Thank you. It's very nice to see you too.
I know that you have a lot of experience with many different written forms. You not only write poetry, but you've also written graphic novels, as we just discussed. I know you've done a lot of work in screenwriting, prose fiction. There are probably other forms I'm forgetting. So I guess an opening question that I have for you is, how does your approach to poetry differ from, say, your approach to screenwriting? Are there any rules of thumb that apply to all your different writing hats or writing modes, to avoid mixed metaphors?
Yeah, I mean, if you bring up poetry and screenwriting, I think those are closer than a lot of people realize, especially when you write poetry like I do, which I'd call lyric. I'd call it probably formal as well. As you know, screenwriting is all about formula, structure. And I tend to come at writing poems in a similar way. I like to have, I'm very dependent on form. I like to have a blueprint of some kind. Even if I change my mind, it's very, very much a part of how I write poems. And I think the other thing is just voice. Whether you're writing dialogue, as you know, as a fiction writer yourself, writing dialogue, everyone sounds a little bit different, or should sound a little bit different. And that's a big part of how we explore character and personality. I'd say most of my poems, I'm very comfortable calling them persona poems. So I think a lot of both screenwriting and poetry are about just doing an experiment in, how would I talk if I were this kind of person or this kind of thing, and using that as inspiration.
We'll probably touch on this later, but I feel like there's often an assumption, I think a fallacious assumption with poetry, equating the speaker with the poet, which of course is not at all always the case. So I guess that's an interesting kind of crux to play with in poetry, is how do you convey a different point of view or a different speaker within such a kind of condensed form?
I think this question is more muddy and more interesting, to be honest, when you write people who are not just, the cliche of the confessional poet or the romantic poet and stuff like that. I'm not denigrating it, but other people, I think when we talk about speaker or persona, there is a more dynamic and permeable interplay between the poet and the persona. For myself, even when I write poems about my own life, I'm more comfortable with the idea that I'm writing in character, even if that's just a self-protective mechanism. More often, I like writing in some wacky persona or tone of voice, because I think it just gives you a lot of freedom, because in the end, no one can accuse you of saying anything. You'd say, oh no, it's the speaker. It's always a convenient mask. I am always interested in talking to fiction writers like yourself, because that is a genre I am less comfortable with, both practically and theoretically, because I think in fiction, that idea of who is talking and why is much more complicated. A conventional third person omniscient narrator, as I think both a poet and a screenwriter, I immediately get way too interested in them. And I'm like, who is speaking to me? What's their agenda? What are they trying to accomplish? And I think with a lot of fiction, trying to make that voice invisible, make it scenery, is a big part of that craft. And it's one that I confess I do not understand. And I'm kind of like the dog that sees the squirrel. I think when I attempt fiction, I get way too distracted by the wrong thing,
I was looking at a craft book called The Writing Moment by Daniel Tysdal. I don't know if you're familiar. He is a Canadian poet. He teaches at U of T Scarborough. But there was this sense, because I think that it is a question for many people who are writers. For example, like my father does visual art, and I had a discussion with him where he said, it's not as confessional, and I don't really think of my work as confessional. But when writing a poem, I felt as though that there was almost the prompts in this book were prompting me to be kind of confessional, or about how I as a person feel about this tension or this dynamic, or like what taboos are or what the forbidden is. And I don't necessarily like to write from my own POV. And I did notice when you were I read The Animal in the Room, and it was interesting, your play with persona poems. I'd never heard that before, and POV. So I just find that interesting. I guess it's not really a question, but I do have a question for you. Because when I was writing this poem, I thought, well, I'd rather write a short story just because that's what I'm familiar with. And I was wondering, because you do work in different mediums, how do you know when something is a poem versus something else?
I think at the end of the day, poems, at least my kind of poems, I think it's the concern with language and sound that comes first. The other mediums I work in, like screenwriting and comics, they're very visual, and I think they're also strongly narrative, right? So I think one thing, if I'm writing something that kind of transcends traditional narrative, or that's more about sound than images or story or character, I mean, that's a poem for sure. I think there are definitely things where I could think about, is this better as screen, or is this better as a comic? I think that's like an interesting debate to have. But for me, yeah, poems are a little bit different, because I think they come to you as sort of like a little earworm. There'll be like an interesting phrase that captures your attention. Image can be interesting, and I know for a lot of poets that's kind of like the grain, like that leads to the pearl of the poem. I hate that metaphor, but anyway, image can come first for some poets, and I think it does for me too. But I think what captures my attention with poetic image, it's more those things that have a friction with the language that we might use to express them. Like, I think, describing a beautiful sunset is a dead end, because you can't say anything more interesting than about how a sunset looks than a picture of the sunset itself, probably. But I think your inability to do that is kind of interesting, like talking around the sunset, thinking about what a certain kind of voice could say about a sunset. Oh, I'm so tired about this metaphor of the sunset now. But anyway, thinking about how someone else would talk about it or fail to talk about it, thinking about how sound represents or doesn't represent it. I think that's more the poetic mode, at least for me, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. I mean, I think part of what you are talking about, at least part of what I'm hearing, is this fundamental crux or difficulty of writing the ineffable, or how do you approach the ineffable through language? How do you write the kind of the numinous, the unreachable? And it seems, as you're talking, I'm realizing that maybe that's one of the things that poetry does have unique access to, because of its, I don't know if that's a fair statement or not, but
yeah, I think that's completely fair. And I think, it's also in what I'd call, the modern age of poetry, and I would go back pre-modernism to like the Romantic era. I think we've all been overtly interested for a long time in that ineffable, in what we can't quite say. But I would add to that, I think the particular power of, poetry, or the sound of language, or language that's pushing at the barriers of what language can do. It's not just the ineffable and not just the failure that are interesting, although they are interesting. It's also that peculiar thing where if you're really, really good and really, really lucky, I think you can get to that place where you don't just fail, you can actually do something new that hasn't been done before. And it's not by aiming directly at the sunset that you get that. And I think this is also like my personal deep discomfort with like things like writing conventional fiction or even confessional poetry. That idea of trying to say something true works well for a lot of brilliant poets. Doesn't work particularly well for me. I usually start by like just trying to do anything, and putting truth and sense aside, and kind of you surprise yourself by getting around to some kind of sense in the end. You can teach yourself something you didn't know how to say or think. And that's a cool thing about language. I mean, I think, language can kind of create reality. And I think that's one of the really fascinating things poetry can do. You're sort of playing with the raw materials of how your brain works, like your source code or something like that.
Since you just used the word source code, a question that I had is, I guess, sort of about your sources. And as you're talking as well, I mean, you are talking about distinctions between screenwriting and poetry, but I know you're also an enthusiastic reader of fiction. And I was curious about, like, who were your first literary loves? What were some of the books that first kind of instilled in you an excitement about reading and writing, or the books that continue to haunt you?
When I was a kid, I read a lot. I read a ton. I got into actually your genre, like horror, very early. I had this draw to like find the scariest book at the library that I couldn't look away from. So yeah, I think I got into reading that way. And then yeah, I liked literary fiction right away. In terms of poetry, I mean, from a very young age, I was fascinated by song lyrics. Like I liked them so much. I have a memory like when I was a really, really young kid, we had Beatles cassettes and ABBA cassettes that my parents had. And I would just take out the sleeve of the cassettes and just like obsessively read and read and read the lyrics and like try to figure out what they meant. And I think that was probably the germ of poetry for me. And right away, like I loved like listening to pop songs on the radio, but I would say like, oh, I wish this line was different. Like, and I would kind of rewrite them to be about what I wanted them to be. And I think that's where poetry started for me.
I love that, trying to reverse engineer ABBA songs. That's great. I have a question on a similar note, because you're talking about how, like poetry, the love of language. An assumption that I make about poets that may or may not be true is when I'm writing fiction, I'm often just sitting on my laptop in a room inside, and occasionally I've been reading Walden lately and kind of cherry picking his world, not plagiarizing, but looking at, he's in a similar area geographically, so trying to collect like flora and fauna from that rather than just putting on my shoes and going across the street to Odell Park. And I do have this idea of the poet like sitting, I don't know, under a tree, like trying to feel things and smell things, because that's what I suppose when I pick up these books intended to teach how to write poetry. But it sounds as though, what you can do, it doesn't necessarily involve going outside, touching grass. Like, how do you approach the research portion? Do you find that a lot of it is similarly just writing in a journal or writing on a laptop, or do you actually have to go and experience?
Yeah, I don't think you have to do anything. Like, I think like most writers, we recognize patterns in terms of what works for us and what works less well. And you can observe those patterns, but I'm always like, you can change them as well. Yeah, so I think that like going outside and sitting in a field, like that would probably work. Sitting at home and staring at a blank wall would probably work. I think a good poem can really come from anywhere. You never know, like you can just like read something or someone will say something that kind of jangles around your brain. So yeah, I think going out and being in nature, or like, scribbling in your notebook and just seeing what happens, these all work for me and have worked for me in the past. But I do try to be open-minded, because I see those patterns in my own practice, like most of us do. But I think the biggest pattern I know how to look out for is like when you hear the poem that, you hear a little bit of it in your head and it wants to get out, you just, wherever it came from, it doesn't matter. You just go write that thing, if that makes sense. I once heard like a novelist say this really smart thing about he says when they had his first baby and they brought it home and they wanted the baby to sleep, so they kept trying to be quiet, or let it sleep, and his mother-in-law came over and said, no, to put on the TV, have people over, put on the music, you want a baby who can sleep through anything. And he said writing is like that you have to be the baby who sleeps through the loud television show. I think, as you say, you need to be able to write when you want to write, not just when you want to write. So I think it's good to be open-minded too, write the poem in nature or sitting at your desk or on the bus, or, put something down when it wakes you up in the middle of the night. I think that's kind of the lesson I take away from it.
Yeah, I like that. And as a more emerging writer than you and Mike, I actually find that to be reassuring because, of course, some writers don't read any craft books. And obviously we're having a podcast partly because we're interested in craft. But I find when you're earlier along, you tend to rely on what other people have done before you. Like The Artist's Way says you should go out and fill the well, or Annie Lamott says that you should like sit under the tree. So it's nice to know basically what you're describing sounds kind of instinctual. It just sounds like you just begin to trust yourself. And I guess that's where voice comes from to an extent, is just going with the flow. So I like that baby metaphor a lot. That's helpful.
Actually, as you were just talking about the process of learning, Miriam, it brought to mind a question I wanted to ask Meghan, which is that I know you are very passionate about, I'm going to use the P word, pedagogy, teaching theory and practice. And I'm actually really interested in how that affects or plays into your writing, poetry, graphic novels, screenwriting, in any, I don't know if you've thought about any connections between the two, but I don't know. Have you thought about that?
Yeah, I think there are connections. I mean, one of the things I try to teach my students is to be interested in their own writing practice, be interested in their own theories of writing, whatever they are, knowing that they'll learn and grow and change throughout their life, because we all do. But I think that's, I think like a lot of teachers, it happens to you backwards. I mean, you give all this advice and all this instruction, and then like 2 years later, you're like, wow, I'm finally learning to take my own advice and do this. But yeah, like I do sort of try to be aware and conscious of the ways I'm changing and growing. I think that, any theory or any practice of writing, it's not obviously empirically true for everyone all the time. It's not even true for you all the time. So yeah, you have to be open to the ways that you're growing and changing. And if there are theories or practices that don't serve you anymore, you can leave them behind. It's okay. In critical pedagogy, we sometimes call this like metacognition, this idea that you can not just have ways of thinking that work for you, but you sort of think about them and you develop them as you go. So as to not be a massive hypocrite, I do try to, adopt those own practices. And yeah, just like that idea that I'm a student, I hope to be kind of a student of writing and composition and my own practices throughout my life. So I hope 10 years from now, I'll know more and different things than I know today.
I love that metaphor. I mean, I think I find that very helpful as well, to remind myself that process is not a static thing, or I don't have to wed myself to a certain process. Like I had always assumed that I was the type of novelist who liked to pants it, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But with my dissertation novel, I decided to, for the sake of making sure I finish in time, I thought I'm going to try plotting in advance. And it made such an enormous difference that I realized, oh, I am not a pantser at all. And I don't have to attach myself to that method. I can actually do this instead, because it's much more conducive to like a smooth kind of fun process for me. Yeah. And I think had I decided, no, I need to follow this one methodology, I wouldn't necessarily have discovered that. So I like the idea of taking new approaches and trying different techniques and seeing how they work.
Yeah, I like it too. And I mean, that actually kind of reminds me, it's another sort of mirror of what we're often doing in the writing classroom. Because I don't know about you, Mike, but I find a lot of what I'm doing, particularly with, students at the beginning of their college career, is sort of convincing them that they're writers, saying you write a lot, therefore you are a writer. Like it would be weird if someone skateboarded 4 times a week and we're like, oh, you're not a skateboarder. Like, of course that person is a skateboarder. So of course they are writers. And I think those of us who are like, from emerging to professionals, we often have the flip problem that we are like, I am a writer. Like, this is what I do. This is how I do it. And we sort of lose, I'm not talking about humility or anything, but I think we sort of lose that sense that we are changing and developing at all times. We're all still learning to skateboard in a real way.
And falling all the time.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, all the time.
Yeah, certainly. I find that relatable. Earlier today I was working on a novel and was looking at for whatever reason, I was watching a video of a blacksmith, and he was talking about, I do find it sometimes helpful to look at more concrete, tangible mediums to encourage myself to have that tenacity, like you say, Megan, kind of convince yourself. I mean, I don't really have trouble convincing myself that I am a writer, but these failures, like essentially the blacksmith was saying, sometimes you do something wrong 4 times only to get it right the 5th time. And that teaches you what doesn't work. Like, that doesn't mean that you wasted your time. It just means that certain things didn't work. And I think it's harder to see that success or failure sometimes in writing, because it's not like a cup or a key or something that has a function, but it is like, yeah, you just have to keep on getting on that skateboard and just like with what did you call it? Meta criticism? Is that what it's called?
Oh, like metacognition.
Metacognition, yeah, this idea of kind of like fuzzy logic, or like continuously adapting your craft or your process according to like the discoveries that you make along the way. So on that note, I do have a question for you. Have you ever had a piece of writing advice that really stuck with you? It could be for better or worse. Mike and I often talk about pieces of writing advice that we can't get out of our heads, and we don't like that, but it could be positive too.
Yeah, well, I remember that one about the baby. I think that's good in terms of, if making this part of your daily practice or your routine. I also think about actually a very experimental poet, Martin Nickel. I remember him because he was one of the more prescriptive poetry teachers I've ever had, in a way that, we would submit poems for workshop and he would always just say, you need to get every ounce of narrative and sense out of this, because he was a very experimental kind of avant-garde kind of poet, which is not my aesthetic, but I always, I tend to sort of hear his voice often in my head when I'm revising, and I think it's made me a much better poet. And, just sort of that feeling of boldness and freedom that comes from that aesthetic. You don't owe anyone anything. You're not trying to make a point here, because if you were, you would be writing an essay. What you think you're talking about sensibly, it doesn't actually matter. It's just how the poem began, and it can be about something else. I studied with Victoria Chang too. She was a wonderful poet and a fabulous teacher in all kinds of ways. And one thing I really took from her is this aesthetic of leaping, kind of connecting to things and making them connect for the very first time as an engine of poetry. I often sort of hear her in my head too, and yeah, just prioritizing like connection of apparently disparate things in poetry, I think has shaped the voice or the style I have today a lot.
I mean, what you're talking about with sort of this idea of disparate images or disparate themes, it brings to mind something else that I wanted to ask you about, which is that, I mean, as evidenced in The Animal in the Room, and also your Nebulas project, the Perennial Nebulas project, that often you're writing sequences of poems that are interrelated. And I was wondering how often you set out to do that in advance, or if it's something that sort of develops organically. Like, do you think I would like to write a book of poems about X topic, or do you find yourself mulling over X topic over a period of time and then realize, oh, I have a lot to write about this and there are multiple different angles, or some combination?
I think that was something that I discovered in myself while I was writing The Animal in the Room. Before that, I really enjoyed writing not just short poems, but I enjoyed kind of the idea of poems as these discrete cut-off units, like a room that you could enter, enjoy, and exit. Like I like kind of a box is how I thought of a poem. And I wrote a lot of sonnets and, kind of approximately length sonnet thing. That's kind of still my comfort zone in a lot of ways. But part of what I really liked about that is this idea that you could write a little thing and be done, and it's its own thing. It doesn't have to relate to everything else. The Animal in the Room, it wasn't so much that I, wrote this little sequence about deer and that was the connection between them. I did start to think about connections between poems as a metaphor. I was thinking of also like genetics and evolution. There's this thing in evolutionary science called like the selfish gene theory, because all of us were taught about like natural selection and evolution growing up, and we were sort of taught it the wrong way, that like the individual animal was being selected for, and that's how evolution works. But the selfish gene theory says it's actually the gene that is being selected for. The reason why evolution and natural selection works the way it does is because the genes are selfish. They're trying to propagate themselves, and the organism is just kind of the vehicle for doing that. So I started thinking of like genetic material in terms of what one poem shared with another poem, not just within my work or within a book, but like, my poem can share DNA with, the Thomas Wyatt poems that I reference in the book, for example. So yeah, I really started getting interested in like connective tissue, these sort of like hyperlinks between all kinds of different texts. And I think once I started to do that, like I couldn't unsee it. And yeah, and then I did start working on the project called Nebulas. She'll be out within a year, I think. And yeah, that was sort of the next part of the metaphor, because I started thinking about like astronomy and astrology, like our ability to see patterns and likeness, to create them even when they don't exist, I thought was a cool place to go next.
Does that in any way connect to your approach to screenwriting? I guess I'm kind of grabbing onto this idea of connective tissue. Do you ever begin with maybe a series of scenes or moments or images that then find their way into the genetic sequence of the screen? Because there is, I don't know, I'm hearing some similarities maybe, but I might be searching.
One of the similarities, I think, is that the reason we all know how to write a screenplay before we've even studied it is because we've seen a million movies. Even if you never thought about it consciously before, like, what the basic arc of a Hollywood movie is because you've seen it thousands of times. And if I show you a screenplay where like the conclusion is way too long, you'll at least be like, something's off here, like even if you can't articulate it yet. So yeah, I mean, I think in this terms of the shared genetic material, we all have to sort of realize that, everything we have to say and everything we think we know about anything is just mimesis, right? Like everything we know and know how to do comes from what we've experienced before. So like we've heard it, we've seen it. Miriam, what you were saying about kind of learning from other writers is true. We're all just basically copying other people, right? And I think it is in sort of like, at least for me, leaning into imitation is the best way I know to like do something original. Like don't sweat it, just know that, you're never going to be better at this than the great poets you're trying to be like. So, realize that like they're your teachers. They are your blueprints. You can't like come out of nowhere and write a brilliant film that's unlike anything that has come before. The best thing you can do is just like steal what works And I think that it's not so much coming in being like, I have a great idea, it's going to be awesome. It's like, do what works. And again, if you're very good and very lucky, you discover the new awesome things that haven't been done before by like accepting that you are a little copy robot.
I like it. It reminds me of, the scientific project is all about kind of people standing on the shoulders of the people who came before. It's less about the self and identity. And I think what you say is interesting and reassuring to a lot of writers, probably, because there is sometimes this fear. I know that Mike has experienced it, and I have too. I can't remember when Midsommar came out, but I remember seeing, like, I had been working on this folk horror novel, and I was in the metro station in Montreal and saw the poster and was like, oh my God, it's been done before. I give up. And I like did stop writing because I had this fear of influence. But now I kind of embrace it. And I do sometimes feel like I was listening to a Catherine Lacey interview yesterday, and she was talking about how when you're really excited about something, kind of like what you're saying, Megan, with the connective tissue, you kind of walk around the world feeling like the world is conspiring to help you. Like, it's almost this delusions of reference. Like, you see connections everywhere. You start to feel like there are coincidences, but I think really you're just like working hard and you're taking in a lot. So it may feel that way because of how productive you're being, maybe. But all this to say, I think it's reassuring to think less about trying to do something original and more about being part of a bigger project. And originality is just natural. I mean, anyone who works has their own distinct voice, which is like DNA in itself. So that's really cool. I really like that.
Thanks. Yeah, I think for me, really like letting go of originality first and foremost, like it would just stress me out, I think, if that was my primary concern. But I know what you're saying is true. Like, it's so natural. Miriam, what you were saying about getting scooped by another movie or a similar book coming out, I think we've all had that experience, and it is aggravating, but I think I've learned how to be really okay with it. Like, if you think about, if you had the same idea as a movie as someone else at the same time, obviously there's something in the air. Like, there's some reason why both of you would have that idea at a similar time. You're living in the same culture, you're consuming the same kind of things. So yeah, as much as it's kind of economically or professionally not always awesome when that happens, I think it is sometimes a sign that like you're onto something. Like the world does need a skateboarding movie to come out right now because it's in the air or something like that. And yeah, I think about the same way with books. I think sometimes you do see these like clusters of film or clusters of books that are kind of similar that come out at the same time, and we could read that as like trends or whatever, or we could read it as just, it's part of like our shared error. So we're probably going to end up being interested in the right kind of things at the right kind of time. And it's a good thing.
Any writer wants to be or poet wants to be conversant in their tradition anyways. There's always a conversation. There is no book or poem that exists outside of everything else. Mm-hmm. So again, I think that's the idea of connective tissue also exists between texts, and I do find that exciting, but also I can also relate to what Miriam is saying, and we have both had moments where we panic to each other saying, I just read this book that is doing exactly what I want to do. That's it. I'm done. I have to scrap this project. She's definitely talked me down out of a couple of those moments as well. So it's very relatable. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like if I do have a piece of advice about that though, it's like if like me, I'm not, for example, like the first person to write a collection with the subject matter of Animal in the Room, but one thing I was fairly deliberate about doing when I started to realize what kind of book I was writing is like I didn't seek out, similar collections that had come out in the past 10 years. I sort of like I became aware of them because people were like, oh, you're doing that? Have you read whatever? And I'm like, no, and I don't really want to. Right. So I think like when you realize that's happening, also NBD, no big deal, but, don't stress about it too much that you feel like you have to like know everything that's out there and do it differently from them. Like you all know, like if I gave the three of us an assignment, like I said, all three of us have to write a novel with the same plot and I like laid out the plot for you, obviously all three of our novels would be completely different, right? Like even though they had the same plot and the same characters, what we did with them would be tremendously different. So like I think what, Miriam brings up the V word voice, whatever, however you want to think about it. But I think a very similar idea done by one writer is going to be very, very different. The other thing that I think we all know as writers is like ideas feel great, but they're cheap. Anyone can have an idea for a book. It's the execution that makes it the book.
Oh, certainly, yes. No, that makes sense. And if I may poke fun at Mike, I mean, was sometimes we would read the same book and I knew what project he was working on. And he'd say, this is the same. And I'd say, like, there are maybe 2 or 3 elements that he's looking at it, but it's entirely different. And I find it interesting, Meghan, that you avoid looking at things that might psych you out, because I know that you're big into sports, which is all about, certain. I played volleyball. I'm aware there's little like superstitions or like, not psyching yourself out. And I wonder if in any way, it's okay if they're not connected at all, but I'm just curious, do you find that like, Nabokov, we all know he was really into butterfly catching. Is there a way in which your sports life intertwines with your life as a poet?
Yeah, I'd say definitely I see all kinds of connections. That's actually what my current project is about. I am doing a volume of sports poetry, and I'm keenly interested in these metaphorical and actually practical connections between a sports practice and a writing practice. And I think it is actually, going back to teaching, one of the ways I got the idea for that connection was talking to my students who are student athletes. One thing that my teachers in critical pedagogy really emphasized is that, obviously all kinds of students with all kinds of backgrounds and abilities are going to be coming into your classroom. And one thing that really good teachers know how to do is to invite students to use their existing knowledge and competencies to apply to new and unfamiliar situations. So for example, being a great tennis player doesn't mean that you know anything about writing, but it does show that you know how to develop a set of skills. You have some discipline and an approach that works for you that probably is somewhat transferable. And I think one of those interesting areas of transfer actually is how you learn from other people. In sports, you can learn to do a lot of things really well by imitating people who are the best. But on the other hand, we know that doesn't totally make sense. Like if you've never picked up a tennis racket before, you can't just watch videos of Serena Williams and like go out and be instantly awesome. You'll know things that, you'll learn things, but you also need to like start from the basics and like work your way up before you can like, even attempt to like do a fast first serve, for example. So yeah, like I think there are really interesting ways, interesting connections. As a poet, particularly as a lyric poet, like I love all these metaphors of like the playing field, the obstacle, the opponent. If you think about who these are, the Spectator, for instance, has resonance to lyric poets who like to think about audience the way I do, who like to think about form the way I do. Like Robert Frost has this great quote that he doesn't like free verse because it feels like playing tennis without a net. And I relate to his that general feeling because I enjoy writing through form as well. But however you feel about form, even if you're not Robert Frost, I think those metaphors of these arbitrary rules and these games lend themselves so wonderfully, particularly to poetry, but I think to all kinds of different writing.
One question I had that I wanted to ask you about is if there is one part of the process that you find particularly rewarding. Like, do you find you're most activated by the conceptualizing and planning of a piece, by composition, or by editing, maybe some other, I don't know. I'm always interested to hear this from writers, which part of the process activates them the most.
I think I can be activated or like really enjoy or not enjoy all potential phases of something. Like, I think it's different from project to project. I think in terms of something where you just get in the zone and takes over, it's like drafting. There's nothing quite like that. Like, and sometimes it feels bad. Like, it feels like someone has like taken over your body and like 3 hours pass and no time. And it's like, it's weird and intense. But I think that there's, the only thing I actually can think of to compare that is sports, where you not all the time, but like if you're lucky, you can get into that zone where your body just takes over and does brilliant things that you don't really understand why you're capable of it. Like, that is the same feeling, I think. I guess I get a lot of pleasure too, like, again, if I'm lucky and something has worked and you're doing revision and you look back at it and you're like, this is actually okay, like this turned out well. That's a really good feeling too. Like, I think we should treasure those moments of validation. When you kind of like forget about something for a while and you come back to it and you said like, oh, I wrote that for real. Like, I didn't know I could do that. That's a great feeling. And unlike the other thing I'm describing, it doesn't require any effort. So maybe I'll go with that.
Yeah, that's something that Miriam and I have also discussed a lot, is coming back to a project after a period of time, and it can go several ways. That there are those moments where you look at something and you think, oh, I actually really like this. But there are also moments I've had where I felt really psyched about something, and then whatever, some other projects or priorities come up, and then I come back to it and I think, what the fuck was I thinking? Like, that can happen as well.
Yeah.
And those moments are strange because it's almost, speaking of metacognition, it's like you're coming at it from a completely different cognitive space or something. Like you're not looking at it through the same vantage point, which is always fascinating to me, that you can see a piece from a completely different angle that way.
Yeah, I find it fascinating too. Like, I think sometimes it's just, evidence of growth, but other times it's something else. Like in the olden times, they used to talk about like the muses and inspiration and stuff like that. And like, I don't think any of that is remotely literally true, but like, I totally get, what those dead metaphors are getting at. And I think like a lot of dead metaphors, we have to like look at them again closely, because there's really something to it. Like, we've all experienced it, this idea that there's something else doing the writing for you. And I can come up with like a ton of like very logical explanations about what that is. Like, we all know the different things that is, but it doesn't feel logical. It doesn't feel like it should be true. It's really neat. It's like, I think that is the thing that kind of makes us all addicted to trying to do this again.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, that's the joy of it. Like, kind of the divine rhapsode possessing you and things flowing out of you. I find it exciting, and I do like when those hours passed and you don't know where they went, but usually revision is required.
Yeah.
After that. That brings me to another question. Because I mean, as if writing wasn't hard and time consuming enough, I once read a quote by Jennifer Egan that I found a little discouraging.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if it applies to poetry as well. She was saying with short stories that when she starts a short story, it never looks the same as when she finishes it. And basically, she says, as a rule of thumb, if something that you've just started, or like your first draft, or even like your first completed, like you think that it's good enough to send out, it will often shift on a foundational level. And I think there is often, for people who don't write, like a myth that you just sit there and it pours out of you, probably even more so for poets because it's a shorter format. So my question is, do you find when you draft a poem, you were talking about that flow state. So when you get into that state and it kind of pours out of you, does it often in revisions end up looking entirely different? Or is it more frequent or common that it just comes out and doesn't require that editing?
I think I am a little bit unusual compared to other poets when it comes to revision. Like, I like sitting with a poem and working on a poem until it's, I'll say, done-ish, because I think, and this is just personal, like, as I'm writing and figuring things out, I feel like I kind of need to see it through to the end, or I think I lose it. You know what I mean? So that does mean, I think, that my revision period blends into my drafting period. and I've spoken to other poets about this, and I am a weirdo in this way. So like take with a grain of salt. I think that, I'd say about like 20% of the time I draft a poem and it's just not working out well, and I just put it aside and figure it out another day. But more often, like if I feel like I'm onto something, I want to get it almost done as quickly as I can. We're not always, sometimes you just have to get up and get on with life even though you're not done. But like I know that when I sit back down again for writing time, like that is still my project, and I have to see it through until it's done-ish is my word, like good enough till I feel good moving on. And I think that I tend to get later in the process, not that I like spend less time, but like I need to sort of see something remotely like the final version before I'm comfortable putting it aside 80% of the time, maybe. Yeah.
That makes sense. And that actually, I'm curious about your process, because if someone were to watch like a time lapse of it, do you find, is it more like you're putting a lot of words out and then deleting them and putting them out? Or do you kind of sit and, sorry if this is too granular of a question, but sometimes when I try to write poetry in particular, I'm so used to, when I work in fiction, just doing kind of like vomiting on the page and then removing like 90% of that. Does that happen in your work?
Yeah, I'm pro vomit, like definitely. And I think that that's often what I need to do. I think I have a poem somewhere. I think you just need to like overwrite and like say a lot of stuff, get it out. Because you quite often you think what the center of the poem, the great thing about it is. I'd say I'm almost always wrong. Like that's just what gets me started. And then the really great thing is what you figure out by vomiting. And I think it's gross. Vomit enough and you will start to see, what the poem wants to be. So as I'm putting out like whatever onto the page, like whatever I'm reaching at, I start to see some little patterns, forms, like the approximate length and shape of the thing, which is what I say, okay, like this is what I think the structure of the poem will be. Whether that's like, hey, we want like 8-syllable lines, or like I think there's 3 parts to this, or I think this is a sonnet, whatever wants to sort of be born there. Then you say, okay, let's take all this crap, as you say, cut, but like more like fill it in, like what else needs to happen for that structure to come true. And I think that's kind of how I come at most of my poems.
Right, that makes sense. Like you can find the container for the vomit after it comes up.
Yeah.
That's cool. That makes sense. I'm now starting to see what you said at the outset, that poetry and screenwriting are not altogether that different. I do like that. I do like containers. I wish there were more of them in short fiction, but alas.
A question that I have as a follow-up to that, once you have a manuscript, so The Animal in the Room, we'll take for example, or Nebulas, does your process still hold true in that case? Do you kind of comb through the manuscript and tease out connections, or do you like to know, like, these poems, I want to leave them intact as they are, and the connections are already there, sometimes abstract, sometimes not so abstract? Like once you have a completed manuscript, do you go back and re-edit, or do you just, for the most part, leave it as is?
Yeah, I think that's also something I learned a little bit about throughout the process of The Animal in the Room. I think I figured out about 4 or 5 poems in the general scale or like approach I was taking, but then I would just sort of like get ideas for new poems. Like it almost sort of grows out as a tree, I found, like with the 2 full-length connections. You know what you're kind of doing, but it can branch out in any direction. And I think for me, part of that, the pleasure of those connections is that it could go anywhere. It could grow anywhere and surprise you. What I did when I wrote Animal in the Room, like I knew there were like certain sequences, some are close together and some are sort of spread out through the book. When I went through like the actual like editing process with an editor, I had the great privilege of working with Susan Holbrook, who was really wonderful to work with. I had a phone call with her early on, and I think she was like the first person who ever read that manuscript who was able to like articulate to me in like 2 brilliant sentences what it was about in a way that I couldn't. She made this great connection to write, I think, like just a handful more prose poems to sort of like connect the various things I was talking about in the book. It was such a great suggestion. And I think that was a great learning experience for me too. I wrote most of the book in 2017, and coming back and writing a few more in 2021. At first, it sort of feels like you're doing a bad imitation of yourself, but I think it is a lesson also in like writing into the connections. So anyone working on like a themed manuscript or a full-length manuscript for the first time, I think that you can totally go through, like, just write whatever poems you think go together for whatever reason, put them in your working order. And then a really fun and productive thing to go back and do is say, do I need to write some poems to sort of like make it work more smoothly? And often you'll do incredible work. Like, it's not just connective tissue, it ends up being some new faves, because something about filling in the pieces, I don't know, it is generative of great new work, for me at least.
That's really interesting. Do you feel that at that point in the process you have maybe distilled the fixations or the mythology of that particular body?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, to quote Bob Ross, a lot of what will happen when you're writing poems is those happy little accidents. Like, you're writing a poem that doesn't seem connected, and then you're like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if I like threw in this word or this phrase from earlier, just because it's neat, like just because it connects. But it does what you want a lot of poetry to do, is to suggest unexpected connections and like twists and turns. And yeah, for me, like, that mandate of connection or repetition, it suggests things that I could not think of if I was writing just one poem. And I think that's why I've sort of come to rely on it, not in a bad way, but like I have come to rely on it as a way of making my work better.
I love that. I think it works really well in The Animal in the Room. It felt like a cohesive album with interludes like they have on concept albums sometimes. Another question for you. I really like your approach to titles, and I'm always trying, especially with short fiction, more so than any long work. It just can be the cherry on top to really put it together if you do it right. And I was curious if you have any advice on that, because you seem to be quite good at it.
Some people tell you to think about titles as part of the poem, which I don't think is bad advice. So I would say, like, I don't know if this is going to be good advice, but I think you should think about titles maybe one or two ways. Like, one of them is part of the poem, almost like the first line of the poem. Another way to think about it would be, I don't like explaining things in poems, but sometimes you kind of have to. Like, sometimes there's like a relevant fact that we can't really get what's going on without it. So I mean, that can be a kind of an easy way of doing that. Like, if there's something that's not abundantly clear that you would like to be abundantly clear, but that feels clunky and bad in the poem, a title is a place where you can be a little bit more prosaic in a comforting way. And I guess another way to think about a title is it could just be invisible. I don't think there's anything wrong with just calling your poem the obvious thing. If there's no compelling reason to, like, your poem's about maple trees, it's okay to call your poem Maple Trees.
I think that is helpful. Like, for example, I liked your poem, The Vancouver Island Marmot. It was as if I didn't realize that there were notes in the back of the book until after I finished it. So I would make notes to myself to look these things up. And, I didn't know that the Vancouver Island Marmot was an endangered species. But it was almost as if the poem could be read without that title. And it has this abstract, rhythmic, it has a pleasure in and of itself that's not semantic. But then it's like you put those two things together and it reads in a whole different way. And so there's almost like a building block element to how to pair those things. And I agree with you. I often use poet or short story titles to be like, in case you missed it, like, so that I don't have to be so explicit in the work itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah. I love your reading of the Marmot poem. And yeah, I think that is one of the things that attracted me to the Marmots and their story. The way that if I imagine what that experience is like, between us, marmots are not that smart, right? Like, I don't think they think about this a lot. But, if you think about the experience of almost being completely obliterated, and, when there are only 21 of you left in the world, does one life become more precious as a result? Like, do you think about, your fellow marmots differently, when they're 1/21st of the entire universe? Do you think about each life as being that much more precious? Or one thing that marmots do, because they're, little scared little rodents, and that's how they survive, is, they do send one out in a potentially dangerous situation to make sure it's safe or not. And that's a good survival mechanism. But if you think about it, like, that's completely ruthless too. Just being like, whatever happens to that one guy is going to happen. We send him out first. Obviously, the metaphorical and emotional registers of that for me were huge. They're like fun to watch too. I love their like quick little scurrying movements, and I tried to capture some of that in the sound of the poem as well.
It was very effective.
Thank
Agreed.
you.
Yes, all of our listeners should buy and read The Animal in the Room. What have you read recently that has excited you, if anything?
Well, I just read a great novel by Michael Crummey called The Adversary that really knocked my socks off. He's a novelist from Newfoundland. It's one of those books that's like definitely literature, but is like compelling and horrific read. It takes place in a 19th century small fishing village, but it's like a terrifying mirror of our own time and place as well. I don't want to say more, but yeah, everyone should go read that one. Another book I read recently that just knocked my socks off is a graphic novel called 20th Century Men by Deniz and Stipan Morian. The art is absolutely gorgeously, horrifically fantastic. It's one of the best written graphic novels I've read that I can think of. I'm not gonna compare it to Watchmen, but it has, I think, a similar approach, but it's a very 2020s look, and it's specifically about Afghanistan and colonialism with a sci-fi, somewhat superheroic angle. And I thought it was just brilliantly done. And I think, like, similarly to The Adversary, I've been thinking about it ever since I read it, which is probably a good sign of a good book.
And on a similar note, what do you makes for a good read? Like, what do you look for in writing?
I mean, I think it can be a lot of things. I have great love, something that you just read and is fully entertaining. I think as writers, we often read for craft and inspiration, which is also fine. Like, obviously we're going to do that, but I love the feeling, when you pick something up and blink and it's over, because it's just taking you and you're not thinking about craft and what you can learn. But on the other hand, I do like particularly poetry where someone just comes in and like dazzles me technically. That can often be the sign of a good poet, a good collection of poetry. So, sorry, bad answer, but I think it can be almost anything,
Given that you have worked in so many modes, I know you said you have maybe a little less experience with prose fiction. Are there any modes or genres you haven't yet written within or explored that you intend to, or that you would really like to eventually?
I would really like to try playwriting or maybe audio play writing. I think that would be really fun. The sad thing is, like, when you say I have less experience in fiction, like almost none. And I think anytime that I've tried to write fiction, it does tend to have, like it turns into dramatic monologue basically, or it turns into like an extended dialogue. I think that's what I tend to get really interested in. So I love writing dialogue and conversations. So I think, yeah, just like more different kinds of scripts, I think, is always fun.
Yeah, I'm also curious about playwriting. I like how, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems so ancient, like dramaturgy. I've just always been attracted how it goes back to Aristotle, and it just seems like this mysterious ancient art. But I feel that way about poetry too, so maybe I just don't know enough and it feels that way on the outside.
No, I think you know everything. Yeah, and I think like back in the day they were more closely related too. Like, not just that a lot of plays were kind of more poetic in their rhetoric. But like, if you think about oral performance and its role, its likely role, assumed role in human history, I mean, what is the difference truly? People who are excellent storytellers, excellent at performance, it doesn't really matter what the content is. Like, we all know that they take on the qualities of both drama and poetry in various ways. Like, people who are excellent at reciting or improvising story, we can make all these easy comparisons to poetry and to drama because they're there. They're obviously doing those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. And it is helpful. It's actually very helpful to talk to you because I probably don't think enough. I was struggling to read poetry until I started to pick up on rhyme schemes more, and then just my brain doesn't, because often when I read it, I'm like, why did they start a new line? Why? And then my mind just like, I try to read it as if it's prose, but once you start to pick up on those rhythms, the like semantics and musicality, it enhances it on a semantic level, I suppose. So it is just very helpful. I mean, Mike and I we do so much prose writing to really think about, like what you were saying, like drama and poetry, things that are more concerned with the sound itself.
I think you're right. Like, I don't like to make like these sort of essentialist arguments or anything, but yeah, like I think the sort of hunger a lot of us have in us for this like musical speech is worth listening to, and maybe just because like it's fun and pleasant. But I think also like the way we think about the connection between structure and meaning, it really matters. Like, it's one of the the fundamental questions we should all be trying to figure out in our lives as like artists or people or whatever, is how much of what we think is structured by how we speak. If it was like 400 years ago, they'd have this like really beautiful and tidy answer for you, is that the structure of your poetry reflected like the structure of truth or beauty, right? Like, if you were writing a really good poem, it would have a certain sound and order, because at heart the universe is sound and ordered. Nowadays we would say, no, that's not how the universe works. But we would say, on the other hand, the accidents that happen when you put untidy language into tidy boxes is, yeah, like sometimes you'll get a line break where we wouldn't think to put one, but now it means something different. So we've learned something new that we couldn't think before because of structure. And that's how I kind of think about it. It's like, you put a certain amount of seawater in an aquarium and you're going to get what you get in there, but it's whatever you get is going to be arbitrary but interesting.
Ooh, that's very exciting. It's like the golden ratio, or it's kind of alchemical. That's really speaking to me and getting me excited about poetry, I suppose, which is good because I have to take a poetry class in September. So at least I'll have some ideas now. So thank you. Your enthusiasm is infectious.
That's great to hear. Yeah, everyone should be excited about poetry. Give poets tens of thousands of dollars.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's so much fun talking about process and craft with you. And yeah, I think you've given people a lot to think about with regards to their own approaches as readers and writers. So thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun talking to you too.
Likewise. And do you have anything to plug? Where can our listeners find you online?
Online, I think the best place to find me is Twitter. I'm at MadMallGreen, or if you just Google my name, that's easy to find. And yeah, like my books, The Animal in the Room, my chapbooks, my graphic novel that I did with Megan Praz is going to be on Amazon.com soon for wide purchase. That will be called One More Year. It's very funny.
Super exciting. Yeah, everybody go out and buy and read all of Megan's work that you can get your hands on. She's brilliant. Yeah, thanks again,
I second
Megan.
that.